before we begin, just wanted to kind of acknowledge this moment that we're in. This is a really hard time for many, and I know that there's a lot going on in your lives, in your personal lives. I know some of you may have been personally affected by what's happening in the world right now. And so before we jump in to all this stuff, just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that this is a time to pause. And my colleague Pia Infante from the Whitman Institute wrote a beautiful blog post last week, really encouraging us all in this moment to take permission to pause and give ourselves permission to pause. So before we jump into all this stuff, why don't we just kind of take a moment, just be in our bodies. If you can, get your feet flat on the ground and take a slow and steady deep breath all the way in, and then hold it when you get to the top. So starting now, just let's release the air. And then take a slow, deep breath in. Hold it at the top, and then let it go. Let's do that one more time. Take a slow, steady, deep breath in. Hold. And then let it all go. And shake it out. Whew. Thank you. Thank you for participating in that. It's a good reminder that we are all humans and we are all dealing with a lot of complexity right now. And again, we are just so grateful for you being here with us today. So what are we doing here today? This is a partnership with the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project and Philanthropy California, which is the alliance of Northern California grant makers, Southern California grant makers, and San Diego grant makers. All of our Philanthropy California folks, can you just raise your hands for the group to see? Thank you, thank you, thank you. So we are partnering with Philanthropy California to bring this programming with you. And I'm gonna share my screen with you so you can see a couple slides. Hold on one second, bear with me. Are you seeing my screen? Okay. So the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project, we just launched in January. We're a peer-to-peer learning and practices the norm in philanthropy. We recognize the inherent power imbalances between foundations and nonprofits, and we believe philanthropy will be more successful, rewarding, and effective if funders approach their grantee relationships from a place of trust, humility, and transparency. Trying to figure out how to go to the next slide. So we have partnered with Philanthropy California to bring programming to people all across the country and the world, really digging into the key principles of a trust-based approach. So this is one of 7 webinars. It's our first one. And we are doing a whole series. So every month we'll be digging into each of the principles. And one thing that's important to note is a trust-based approach is really a holistic approach. So it involves these multiple principles practiced together. But because there's a lot of questions and nuance related to each principle, we've broken it out into a month-by-month webinar series. So after this webinar, we will be sending out a link for the next one. So we hope that you'll sign up for that. And we'll be publishing this all on our respective partners' websites, as well as the Trust-Based Philanthropy website. We haven't gotten all this info up yet, but we'll tell you how you can tune in to get that info as it's all coming together. So I wanted to just give a thank you to our partners at Philanthropy California for being such great planners and thinkers. Kate Seeley from Northern California Grantmakers is the woman behind the curtain managing all of the stuff on the back end. So if you have any issues or questions with the Zoom platform, feel free to send Kate a chat. And thank you, Kate, for keeping us all moving so smoothly. Before we go into our program, I want to introduce our speakers for the day. Just want to make sure, are there any questions or anything that you'd like us to address before we jump into the program? Woman in front of the curtain. Kate is the woman in front of the curtain. All righty. So I'm going to hand it over to my colleague and also the chair of the steering committee of the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project, Pia Infante, to just give us a quick or an introduction to what trust-based philanthropy is all about and what we're all talking about. Pia, please take it away.
Thanks, Shadi. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good apocalypsean times. I'm not really sure. I really appreciated the breath we took together, and I actually really love seeing all of your faces. So I'll be happy to get back to that Brady Bunch style screen. I also just want to say there are like 175 of you that registered for this, and what's clear to me as a parent, as someone who has family members directly affected, is that every choice we make right now, but every second that we have feels like an essential and critical choice, and things that sort of aren't as useful, I think we're turning away from. So it feels wholeheartedly great that so many of you want to be a part of this conversation. And it's really a conversation. You know, we don't hold the trust-based philanthropy principles as some kind of prescriptive set of rules or like grammar rules. They really come from a place of like values, a set of values. So I think that you have seen the principles broken out in many ways. And what I wanted to say in this introduction to trust-based principles is that we've always understood them as the behavioral sort of the part of the iceberg that you can see, when underneath what we really are aiming for is a wholesale, you know, sort of systems, culture, power shift, right? I mean, some of the dilemmas that we're in right now, life and death dilemmas, have to do with systems and structures that are not centered around community and the needs of the most vulnerable. So that's really essentially where the spirit of trust-based philanthropy comes from. We listen to many, many nonprofit and movement partners who gave us marching orders that we needed to get philanthropy to take up a different approach, a different way of inhabiting the role of funder and donor. So this slide just names some of the values that are really driving the principles and our understanding of the kind of culture and systems, sort of structural changes that we really need, both inside of individual institutions and, you know, moving out into greater and greater social and political structures that we live in and economic structures that we live inside. And there's just nothing like a crisis of this proportions to really show us, you know, what isn't working in our world. So, anyways, we think of this work as an ecosystem, and a lot of the principles are really oriented and written from a sort of relationship between a grant maker and a recipient of funds. So that's just one level. We also think of the culture that needs to shift and change as inside the foundation, between in the relationship between foundation staff and foundation boards, and also in nonprofits themselves, in making sure there's accountability between the nonprofit staff and the communities that they serve. So we think of trust-based principles as sort of guideposts for ecosystem, a kind of trust-based ecosystem, right? So when we're rolling in this way, and I'm just going to shout out my colleague Phil from Robert Sterling Clark, you know, the ecosystem that Phil as a leader has helped to cultivate collaboratively with his staff team, with his board, with the nonprofits they support, and with the communities that those nonprofits support, made it possible for Robert Sterling Clark to act very swiftly to reassure their partners during a very uncertain and terrifying time economically and in many other ways, that they would receive another year of support on top of what they've already been committed. That of course they don't, there's no undue kind of exacting expectations of them during this time. So what we believe is, yes, it's really important to focus on that that relationship between grantor and grantee partner, and um, it's also looking at the whole ecosystem. So we just wanted to say that briefly before we take one of the principles, which has been talked about a lot in our sector for the past week, which is about multi-year unrestricted funding. So just wanted to give this context, give this backdrop, and really name that somebody wrote in the chat box, there's no better time for trust-based philanthropy, and that's absolutely true. Trust-based philanthropy has something that we've been promoting as a collective when times were relatively, concerning, but especially now feels critical to talk about, and I'm glad that you all are here to add to this conversation. So I'll give it back to you, Shadi. Hope that was cogent.
Thank you, Pia. And can you comment a little bit more on this particular moment and what you're seeing and why there seems to be this kind of leaning toward more trust-based practices?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that we, in the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project, we feel like we've been connected to and have known a pretty large network of funders who already operate in this way, right? They already listen to communities and partners. They already partner in a spirit of service. They're already collaborative, humble leaders who have really reimagined kind of a gatekeeping or a kind of administrative role, and really see their work as part of, weaving together partnerships for social good, progressive change. I think that it was interesting. I've been talking about this for a while now, so I apologize if some of you just heard these things over and over again from me. But over the years, people have often said things like, that approach can only work if you're, a tiny foundation with, and you have complete control over all the levers. It could never work, in a larger philanthropy. We could never imagine, streamlining our paperwork, having funds be unrestricted because we're strategic and we want to have specific policy impacts. I think it's interesting in a time like this that all of a sudden those reservations have evaporated for many philanthropies. So philanthropies are saying, wait, I'm sort of paying attention to the moment that we're in. We could really lose, we're devastatingly, we're losing human beings. And then institutions and organizations are very threatened by this time. And in the nonprofit sector, I think that the clarity that what nonprofits really need right now is a partnership that is more like, hey, we're in it with you, right? We get that we may have given you a grant to run a youth development program, but right now, maybe it's much more important to help families navigate this time, to get health insurance. Who knows? Who knows what communities are really asking for? And if we are so controlling about what grant dollars are used for, then we've been inviting people to sort of fabricate whatever we want to hear, and we're not being truly responsive. So I'll say that all of a sudden, more philanthropies have wanted to turn this way or act this way. You may have seen the pledge that went out from the Council on Foundations. And I think pledges and promises are great. And really for us, it's about, what really changes now and for the long term, because we don't see trust-based philanthropy as emergency response funding, right? Emergency know, there's a crisis, we fund in that way in an unrestricted stream of, you know, flow of resources, and then, you know, the crisis is over and we revert back. That is not what we believe here. We think that this is, and also we don't know, we're very uncertain about, obviously, what's going to happen with this pandemic in our country. We've no idea what the long or short road really looks like. So this kind of partnership we think is necessary to help rebuild and reimagine a strong public sector that can try to pick itself up and weather not just this, but we have no idea what other pandemics of different kinds are in store for us. So instead of thinking of trust-based philanthropy as an emergency response or crisis funding, which some philanthropies might be holding it as, we really are holding it out and challenging the sector to imagine it as one of the best ways to frame partnership for building a society that actually addresses the needs of everyone, whether we're talking about democracy, the economy, or anything else. So that's my quick take on it, and I'm happy to stop talking and start hearing from other people. Thanks.
Thank you, Pia. So that was Pia Infante, co-executive director of the Whitman Institute. We'll be hearing from her a little bit more. I wanted to actually, before we move along, you know, we are in this moment, as Pia mentioned, where there's a lot of quick action to bring more flexibility to nonprofits. And I think this is a moment, we're in this moment of crisis. How have you, Phil, how has your team responded to this current moment? And what have you done to kind of support your nonprofits at this critical time?
So thank you, Shadi. And hi, everybody. Welcome back. We're officially in a pause here in New York, which is the acronym that they're using for us to sort of step away and take a breather from all the activities outdoors. So that seemed appropriate. But anyway, what we did here in New York is we did a quick call out to all of our grantees and just to see how things were going. And that was 2 weeks ago, actually, today. And we're able to sort of hear what was going on and things that I'm sure almost all of you have heard in terms of kind of nervousness about funding and staffing and people working the front lines who might be susceptible to getting COVID. And what we were trying to do is figure out how we could respond quickly. And as Pia had mentioned early on, is that it really is an ecosystem, and it's really something that we framed as a staff that afternoon after we kind of had heard a lot from our grantees in terms of what our response would be. And over the course of the weekend, worked with our executive committee and then went to the full board on Sunday night with our proposals, and then turned it around on Monday morning. We had approval to move forward. And a lot of that is their trust and belief in the work that we're doing and how we do our work. I don't think otherwise it could have happened. Certainly there were some concerns about kind of what does that mean for our endowment and things of that nature. But the bigger thing was like, how can we serve our communities and how can we be supportive of our grantees in this time? And so what we were able to do and go back is affirm and honor all the grant commitments that we had made previously. So there was no question about that. I'm sure many folks are doing that. Probably the one twist is, since we already do general operating or unrestricted funding, multi-year support to all of our grantees, we didn't need to do any of the unrestricting or changing. And so we were thinking like, what more can we do to be supportive? And so what happened is we came up with this idea of what we call +1, which was adding 1 year of funding to every grant that is out there. So if you were a grantee whose multi-year expired or got completed in 2019, we would automatically add another year so that you would have coverage for 2020 and didn't need to worry about applying. And if you're already midstream, we will add 1 more year to the end of your term. And so what we're trying to do is thinking about the mid to longer term. And so how do we provide assurance and let people know that we were standing by them and we're going to be there and believe in their work. And so that was the statement that we were trying to make and affirm to all of our grantee partners in a moment where many of them were slightly nervous or very nervous about kind of what future funding might look like and what support would be. And those are the big things around kind of multi-year general operating funding or unrestricted support. And then certainly there are a bunch of initiatives that are taking place here in the city that are kind of midstream in terms of trying to figure out what that will look like. And rather than do something on our own, we wanted to actually be in partnership and collaboration with other initiatives so that we could have a more coordinated effort here in New York to address what was going on. But there were some other components that are that sort of capture the spirit of trust-based, but they're kind of more about streamlining and reporting and things like office hours and providing Zoom subscriptions to all of our grantees. But that's kind of what we were able to do. And so on Monday, the 16th of March, we were able to go out and send that letter to all of our grantees to reassure them that we were going to stand alongside them and let them focus on their work and not us.
Phil, you're getting a question from the group. How have you done any further streamlining of reporting?
So the way that our reporting works currently is we actually do a verbal report with our grantee partners. And so what we did is actually said, you know, we had scheduled many of them already for the spring, and we basically said we would release them and come back to them later in the year, and that it could be another verbal report, or it could be Zoom, or it could be not at all. And so we were giving people that flexibility to help let them focus on the work right now and not spend time worrying about reporting or anything like that.
Thank you, Phil.
Yeah.
And for folks in the chat, I sent a link out of the blog post that Robert Sterling Clark Foundation put out describing the actions they took in support of nonprofit partners, so you can learn a little bit more there. I'd like to bring us back to our focus on multi-year unrestricted funding. And I'd like to introduce our third speaker, Claire Knowlton, who is the Director of Advisory Services at the Nonprofit Finance Fund. She also leads the Full Cost Project, which has been a multi-year initiative to really take a look at what are the full costs that nonprofits need in order to thrive. So Claire, I wanted to toss it to you to share a little bit more about your perspective on why is unrestricted funding so critical, especially in the context of what's happening right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that question, Shadi. And for some reason, I realized that my name, I don't know if you all are seeing this, my name says I'm Pia, which is like, what a wonderful honor to be Pia. But my name is Claire. So something, oh, now it says Claire. I don't know if other people saw that. Okay. No, that's a great question. And I wanted to answer that first by talking exactly how unrestricted support builds the financial sustainability of organizations. Because often when we talk about the value of unrestricted support, we talk about day-to-day expenses. We talk about unmet infrastructure needs, you know, with words like overhead or indirect costs that aren't being covered. And that conversation is important, it is real, but it is also limiting because the sector has gotten stuck talking about these underfunded expenses and become somewhat blind to a whole range of costs that live outside of this false dichotomy of direct or indirect, that live outside of this unholy trinity of program, G&A, and fundraising. And so what NFF's full cost framework does is it's a way to lift the sector out of that narrow view of costs and really name and claim everything that it takes to run an effective, impactful nonprofit organization for the long term. And this is the work we've been doing in partnership with Philanthropy California in the Full Cost Project, is really spreading knowledge about the full cost framework and how to apply it. So I am just going to talk about two types of costs that live within the full cost framework. There are more, but these are the ones that are most relevant right now. And they are first, working capital, which is unrestricted cash on an organization's balance sheet to manage cash flow and manage delays in payment without interruption to normal operations. And the second is reserves, which is also unrestricted cash on the balance sheet, but the purpose is to help survive a bad year, to take advantage of new opportunity, or to make changes in the face of changing conditions. And so right now, we are seeing in real time how organizations without adequate unrestricted cash on the balance sheet to respond to this crisis are in real danger of suspending operations altogether. NFF has been serving nonprofits about this crisis, and I have Some very preliminary findings that I can share with you. I want to emphasize that they are preliminary, but I think that they are telling, so I offer them here with trust. So what our early results are showing is that in California, 70% of respondents have already lost earned revenue. 56% of respondents have already lost contributed revenue. And 2/3 of respondents have said that this crisis right now already is a threat to their ability to exist long-term. Others have said they are expecting that it could become a threat later in 2020, but right now, 2/3 are saying this could potentially shut them down. And I just want to acknowledge that, like, while this crisis feels like it's been going on forever, we should remind ourselves that it's actually only been a matter of weeks. They've been really, really bad weeks, but it's been weeks, not months, not years. That's causing 2/3 of respondents in California to say this could close our doors. So why is our sector so perpetually financially fragile? Why is it that most organizations don't have adequate working capital, don't have adequate reserves? It is because they have no way to build them. So to get just a little bit technical, the accounting mechanism by which organizations build working capital or reserves is unrestricted operating surpluses, meaning that unrestricted revenues are greater than expenses for the year. So that unrestricted surplus is what builds an organization's balance sheet health. It's what turns into unrestricted net assets on the balance sheet, that organizational safety net. Unrestricted surpluses accumulate over years to become a more robust organizational safety net. And this should make some intuitive sense, right? So if in your personal life you imagine that a financial advisor came to you and said, like, hey, here's the secret to building financial stability for your family. I want you to take your paycheck. I want you to take everything you earn. I want you to spend it down to zero, down to the penny. There should be nothing left in the bank account at the end of the month. You know, we would all laugh that person out of the room, but that is exactly how our restricted grant contracts are structured for nonprofits. Spend every penny. You aren't allowed to generate any sort of a surplus. And in fact, if you find efficiencies, if you are able to deliver what you promised at a lower price, well, we'll take any of that money back. So this is the value of unrestricted funding that we don't talk about enough. We all say we want resilient, effective organizations that can weather the storm, that can keep delivering on their mission in their community for the long haul. But the predominant foundation funding structure of restricted grants is fundamentally misaligned with that goal. So to close out my talking points, you know, I just wanted to share a few additional data points with you. Shadi, I don't think it's necessary to bring up the screen and, you know, make us close down, but wanted to name that every few years NFF surveys thousands of nonprofits across the country for our State of the Nonprofit Sector survey. And in our last survey, which was in 2018, before this crisis, we asked nonprofit leaders to name their top 3 operational or financial challenges. And the top 3 were achieving long-term financial sustainability, raising funds that cover full cost, and raising unrestricted revenue, which are sort of all like one and the same. But year after year, these 3 consistently show up as the top 3 most pressing needs. So this is what the nonprofit leaders are telling us. And then one more data point that I will share is that less than half of nonprofit leaders include working capital or reserves in their budget plan for the year. And that really makes sense, right? Because as a sector, organizations are really struggling to just get their day-to-day expenses covered. It is hard enough to break even, let alone generate a surplus to think about building that working capital and those reserves. But if we can make unrestricted funding the norm and not the exception for the sector, we can change that picture and we can build a more resilient sector that is ready to face the next crisis. So I will stop there and turn it back to you, Shadi.
Thank you, Claire Knowlton. That was really great. Some really useful data points. Thank you for sharing that. We do have some great graphics that Claire put together that we can send out to the group after this, so you can access some of that information in writing. I'd like to bring it back to Pia Infante, co-ED of the Whitman Institute. We saw you had a little assistant on your lap who just stepped out of the room. Hopefully she'll make another appearance. Pia, as one of the kind of early architects of trust-based philanthropy at the Whitman Institute, you know, we often talk about multi-year unrestricted funding as one of many, but it really is one of the cornerstone approaches in a trust-based approach. Can you shed a little light on the Whitman Institute's approach toward multi-year unrestricted funding, and also how you see unrestricted funding as distinct from general operating funding?
Sure. Well, my assistant slash supervisor is now Bank Rum, so I apologize for that. Let's see, what's your question? I actually want to speak to the terminology. So there's, you know, we have the full cost project here. Claire, that was so helpful. Thank you so much. It really speaks to why this is not an emergency funding approach, and that folks like you and others have been thinking about how, oh, she's back with her drum stick. So it speaks to what we have been thinking about for a long time, which is to take nonprofits out of a starvation cycle, basically. And so the way we think of this kind of funding, and I want to talk about terms and maybe even pull in fantastic ally lawyer Jean Tom on this, regardless of what terminology we are using, general operating, unrestricted, full cost funding, operating funding, I think what's important is the intention underneath the tool, right? These are all tools. These are grant making tools. They have been used, they can be used in many different kinds of ways, and some more open and in a spirit of partnership, and some less, right? So it's not this, it's not a grammar point, right? It's really a value. Again, it's a values point and a practice point, and what is the intention and motivation underneath the tool. You know, we've heard people who have quote unquote received general operating support say that it's so restrictive that they don't count it as unrestricted support in some ways, right? So, and Claire probably, and Jean will have, you know, maybe more precise definitions here, but I think regardless of what the type of funding is, and there might be different uses for different terms at different times. Right now, one question that some people might have is how relatively easy or difficult is it to go from a restricted grant to an unrestricted grant right now, right? In this fiscal year, in this moment, you know, given everything that we are seeing and what Claire has just said. And according to our friend Jean, who's on the line, who might want to jump in here, actually, it's really a matter of just resetting terms, just sending a new grant agreement with the new, you know, new understanding, right? And new understanding of what quote unquote then evaluation or reporting might look like. And then Jean, I am going to call on you if you're willing to speak. I think that it's important to say that general operating support has been very embraced in the sector, both before the COVID moment and now. And there might actually be reasons to be flexible about that, and we haven't even used the term flexible funding, but be flexible about what terms we're using for different purposes. For instance, if there is an organization, a project with a small budget that is fiscally sponsored by a larger entity, it might be useful to use a slightly different terminology with the same spirit, right? Maybe it's a project, you know, restricted grant that's then unrestricted once the project receives that grant. But because I think we can get caught up, you know, in the name of the tool versus kind of the understanding and the spirit and motivation underneath it, we can get stuck kind of in loopholes. So Jean, if you're here, are you here?
Yes.
Can I call on you? Yeah, just to briefly speak to this, because I feel like you're just such an expert here, and I learn so much every time I talk with you.
Well, thank you, Pia, and thank you for inviting me to participate here. So my name is Jean Tom. I'm an attorney that represents foundations and nonprofits, and I had been actually exploring these questions with one of my clients. They were wanting to move to trust-based philanthropy models before this crisis, and had actually been talking with Lisa Cowan at Robert Sterling Clark, and then also chatting with Pia and John about this. And one of their questions was, what are the legal requirements and that might prevent them from moving to these models? And I understand that this might be a question that others are also exploring. And I think so. They asked me as a lawyer, what is absolutely required? And what I said to them was, if you are making grants to 501c3 public charities, you can absolutely, make general operating unrestricted grants. And then in terms of reporting, it's really up to you. You have to do the due diligence on the front end to make sure that it is a 501c3 public charity you're making the grant to. But beyond that, you really can loosen the reins. And we also checked in with foundation's auditors to also make sure that was the case, and they affirmed that as well. So that was very helpful to that client to feel like that legal roadblock, at least with respect to public charity grants, was not in the way. And then the question Pia and I were discussing, well, so say you have restricted grants out there, what do you have to do to shift in this moment? And really, those are restrictions that you as the grantor have placed upon them. It is entirely within your power, and under state law, it's permissible for a grantor to amend and lift and modify those restrictions. And so really what it takes is an amendment to your grant agreement. You could have a form where you essentially amend your grant agreement and say, any prior project restrictions have been lifted, and this is now amended to become a general operating support or unrestricted grant. So it can be as simple as that. The fiscal sponsorship point is maybe a little bit more complex because obviously if you're granting to a fiscal sponsor that is your 501c3, if you're saying that it is an unrestricted grant to the fiscal sponsor, that means the fiscal sponsor can use it for any number of their fiscally sponsored projects. So there are some, perhaps nuances there, but I think Pia is right. If you want to, that the intention is the most important point, that within the project grant that you make to the fiscal sponsor, you can say that the use of the funds is unrestricted. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Jean, for jumping in and for being such a great thought partner here. Just FYI, Trust-Based Philanthropy is going to host an upcoming webinar on kind of the legal side of trust-based philanthropy, featuring, of course, Jean Tom, who just spoke up here. So hopefully I have addressed your actual questions, Shadi, and I'm going to give it back to you because I think we probably have only a few more minutes for Q&A.
Thank you, Pia. Thank you, Jean, for offering that really valuable information. I'm sure that many on the call found that useful. I wanted to bring Phil Lee from Robert Sterling Clark Foundation back on the line because Phil, when you stepped in as president and CEO of Robert Sterling Clark about 4 years ago now, I think, you made the deliberate effort to shift all grants to multi-year unrestricted. Can you share about why that was important and how you went about that process?
Sure. So when I came to the foundation 4 years ago, I had been, in many ways, thinking about what it meant to be on the grant making side of the equation for many years. And kind of what informed kind of the thinking that came about, the two things. One, the actually first half of my career was actually in finance and on Wall Street. And the way that we always looked and thought about organizations that we were either making loans to or I was a bond rater was looking at kind of the entire organization or enterprise and sort of looking at the strategy, the leadership, the resources that it had and what it was trying to accomplish. And that was always that lens that we looked at as kind of like a holistic look at an organization. And so that probably informed some of my own thinking about that's the way that I would always want to be looked at as well, as opposed to just a particular project or a particular strand of work. And then subsequently, after I did that, I went and became the executive director of a nonprofit here in New York, and I was a grant seeker. And my own experience in being in that role of the hoops and the obstacles and the challenges that were put in front of us as we were going through this grant seeking process and getting funding for specific projects, and then having to kind of fill out budget templates that had all these different things. And, you know, there were times where I was like pulling out my hair, and then there were some times where it's just like, these numbers are fungible, so let's do stuff. Hopefully none of you are my funders at that time, but this whole thing is just like, it was like, all of this to what end, right? And so when I came to Robert Sterling Clark, the whole idea is like, you know, the people that we partner with, the organizations we partner with, are doing incredible work, and our vetting and our kind of doing the homework, if you will, of understanding what they're doing, what they're trying to do. That's our job and that's our responsibility. But once that's done, you know, we believe that they know better how to deploy those resources, what they need to do with them, and how to get the work done. And that is critical. And so for us, it was like, this is the way that we want to do our work, and this is the way that we want to partner with organizations. And so really spent some time with our board, and a couple of them have come from nonprofit, and so appreciated that perspective. And a number of them come from other industries where that kind of holistic look at an enterprise was part of that work as well. So, you know, we had those conversations, and then ultimately we as an institution decided that we would do all of our grant making as general operating support. And so that's how we've done it since I arrived.
Thank you, Phil. We wanted to shift toward some FAQs. So, you know, we've been on the road, Phil, Pia, many of our other trust-based colleagues that are on this call, John Esterly, and others who I probably can't see, have been on the road sharing about trust-based practices and really fielding a number of questions. And I know for some of you on the call, you're looking for tips on how to make the case to your boards or how to respond to the critical questions that do come up. So we've surfaced a number of those kind of most commonly asked questions. So we're going to move into a portion where we're going to be addressing some of these, what we call the skeptical questions about multi-year unrestricted funding, hopefully to shed some more light on how you can respond to those questions if they come up, and how you can better understand the value and how to kind of rethink certain processes in this context. Then we'll reserve the last 15 minutes of this call for actual interactive Q&A. But if questions are coming up for you as we're talking, please chat them in the chat box. I'll be monitoring those, and we'll be serving those up to our speakers. And thank you for sticking with us. I just noticed we still have over 100 people on the line, despite all the technical difficulties. So thank you for being here. So I'm going to just put it on our screen, on my screen. One of the first skeptical questions we get is, hold on, let me just do view slideshow. How do you measure impact with unrestricted grants? This is a big question that comes up quite a bit. I think some of you who registered also asked this question. So I'm going to toss it back to Phil Lee from Robert Sterling Clark to share his perspective, and then we'll do then we'll invite Pia to also share.
Impact, that is the one that we often get, or one of the most often ones. And I think at Robert Sterling Clark, we come at it from two different perspectives. One of them is kind of a little bit akin to what many foundations already deal with in terms of like asking, you know, what metrics and things like that. But for us, I think this is kind of in the trust-based approach, or looking at it from that lens, is that we actually ask each of our grantees, what does success look like for you? And how do you assess yourself? How does your board look at you? How do you know when you've been successful in delivering what it is that you do to your communities? And that is for us kind of a springboard into conversations with them on kind of the impact of their work and learning in that way. And so for that, you know, our grants are a small part or a portion of many grants that comprise that work. And so that is how we initially talk to them about, like, what does it mean to be successful, and what's the impact that our grant making is having as component of the work that you're doing. I think the second thing is that in a trust-based framework, there's an invitation to think about what does impact look like in a different way as well. And so we do something, and this came up a little earlier, we do something with all of our grantees. It's called a chat, which is something, it's an acronym for check-in analysis tool. And it is a verbal report that we do with each of our grantees, and we provide questions in advance. And the reason we have that is really, it's an opportunity for conversation, but it's really, as a learning organization, we're really interested in learning and hearing what they're learning and how they're incorporating that into their work. And as part of that, we actually ask each of our grantees if we can record it. And everyone has always said yes. Maybe they'll never say no because we're the funder, but and it gets transcribed, and we offer them the opportunity to have one of the transcriptions and to make any changes or edits if that doesn't feel right. But the bigger thing is not for us to sort of listen back carefully to each of the words. We actually have 2 external evaluators that listen and review the transcripts, and they are listening for themes in terms of ways in which we are engaging with our grantees and what impact that has had on their work. And so it's really, if you take this handle, instead of return on investment, it's return on relationship. And so they're trying to see, is there really trust that's there? Is there a way in which they're sharing information that they might not otherwise? And so that's kind of the second way in which we sort of learn about some of that work. And then there's a third component, which we do periodically, which is right now every 3 years, which is called a flexible funding impact survey. And it's really trying to gauge and understand what the impact of flexible funding has been on their way that they do their work and whether that's been changing over time. A little bit of that is couched in our interest in trying to make the case to the field for increased flexible funding for grantees. And so that's how we have captured kind of this larger question of impact with our grantees and the work that we're doing.
Thank you, Phil. So 2 kind of big themes that we're seeing is, one is number of foundations are turning the lens on themselves, kind of understanding how well they are doing their work as funders. Other funders are inviting opportunity for grantee partners to define their own success measures and share learnings along the way. Pia Infante, the Whitman Institute, do you want to share some insights here?
Yeah, I just had a couple of thoughts, which they're coming up in the chat as well. So what is our definition of impact? And we care about people. So in some sense, one of the things we look for is what is the impact that our partners, you know, the actual people and leaders in the organizations we support, what is the impact on them? And we get their feedback a lot. It's part of what got us to the trust-based frame. So, so one thought is being curious about the impact on the health and wellness of the people in the organization, and again, the long-term resilience of the organization. And the second way that we think about it, and John is here in case you want to call on him, is we're pretty modest about the idea of what our foundation's impact could be at kind of a grander social, political, economic scale. One, in terms of the size of our portfolio, but also just attribution is a tough one to claim, right? Even when one maybe has hundreds of millions of dollars to pour into an issue, or, you know, and I think there are certainly times where I have seen that a stream of funding has had a powerful impact, you know, on policy or something like that, or on, you know, in funding advocacy, the advocates and have been able to move things in important ways. So it's not that we don't care at all about impact. It's more about the question of attribution, and also human impact matters to us. So those are the 2 thoughts I have about that. And we often ask our grantees just how they're doing. You know, we had office hours last week just to let folks come and check in if they wanted to about how they're doing, because, you know, often in the impact strategy conversation, we don't look at the cost of moving those measures, whether they are policies or some kind of structural change, the cost on human beings. So those are just my quick thoughts about this big question that we get a lot.
Thank you, Pia. And thank you for those who are chatting in the chat box. Great points being made there. So the next skeptical question that we sometimes get is, doesn't unrestricted funding create greater risk that foundation dollars will be misspent? I'm going to toss this one to Claire Knowlton to start us off. How would you respond to this skeptical question, Claire?
Sure, it's a question that I get a lot, and the short answer is no, it does not increase risk. In fact, it reduces risk in a lot of ways. I think it's really interesting to take these questions and flip them and apply them to temporarily restricted funding, right? How do you measure impact for temporarily restricted grants? How do you measure impact for what is the risk of funds being misspent with restricted grants? How do you know that they are properly spent? Because I think our answers there are often a little bit weaker than we might assume. We've sort of assumed that the way that we measure impact for restricted grants, is good, but we've confused dollar inputs as proxies for impact and results. And I think with this question as well, we have confused and assumed that restricted grant making sort of gives us an ideal way of knowing that funds are well spent when it doesn't. So I want to kind of talk about some of the assumptions underlying this question. One is that restricted funds are optimally spent, and they are certainly not. There are often much more meaningful and constructive ways that funds could be spent in an organization than is allowed by a restricted grant. I think it's important to remember that our grant cycles often mean that organizations are working against an approved budget that might be a year old, and that things have changed, prices have changed. And most organizations are going to avoid the trouble and the perceived reputational risk associated with going for a budget modification. So certainly in NFF's work, we see a lot of spaces where organizations could better spend their restricted money, but because of the structures in place, they just say, well, I don't want to leave this money on the table, so I'm going to buy way more of these supplies than I need right now because I don't want to let the money go to waste, or I don't want to let the money get diverted from my community. Another assumption that's kind of hidden under this question is that foundation program officers somehow have better information than nonprofit leaders about how to spend the money effectively, and that the restriction allows us as the foundation to assert that control over how spending happens and kind of say, like, we know best. And of course, like, that's not the case, right? We all believe that those who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. We all know that the nonprofit leaders have better data and real-time data available to them that we don't to guide their spending decisions. So really, restricted funds carry with them the risk that funds are spent ineffectively because the decisions are being made by people who have less information, which is us, the foundation. And then, finally, if we are actually in this question talking about the few bad actors that exist in the sector that are willing to commit some sort of fraud and take resources away from the most vulnerable in our society, those people will have no problem lying on your restricted grant reporting budget about how they spent the money. So there's no added protection from the very rare bad actors that a restriction gives that unrestricted funding doesn't give.
Thank you, Claire Knowlton. Pia Infante or Phil Lee, anything to add to Claire's great points? Excellent. So what's another skeptic? Thank you, Claire. That was really, really excellent. I really appreciate that you were challenging the underlying assumptions in that. There's clearly a lot of power and control couched in that question. And I appreciate you shedding some light on that. Another question we get is, how do you remain open to new prospective grantees if all your money's tied up in multi-year commitments? And I'm going to toss this one to Pia Infante to shed some light on how the Whitman Institute approaches this.
Yeah, And again, this goes back to the fact that these principles are not like a set of grant making rules that are rigid, right? It's meant to underlie, there are a lot of values underlying it. So for us, the way we've dealt with having some funds for emergence, for instance, what's happening right now, is that we have a portfolio that is multi-year unrestricted funding for 3 years at a time that renews. And then we also have set, historically we're spending out. So these things are changing in our final 2 years, but we've historically set aside an annual fund that has sometimes been used as a rapid response fund. So it's more about how we want to think about the relationships with our long-term partners and what's useful for them to know that they have committed from us. They've told us that's very helpful. At the same time, in our annual fund, we have also been able to address things that emerge and that are very concerning, or sometimes, like, for instance, we've used some of our annual funds this year to increase our grants to our current multi-year partners, a set of them, because the urgency of, like what Claire mentioned, for the organizations feels very, very real. So that's one way to think about it.
Thank you, Pia. Phil, anything to share here? You're muted.
Sure, just a quick add-on is one, part of the way that we try and adjust some of it is that we stagger all of our grants. So there's always some group that is rolling off at any point in time. And I guess the other thing that I would just remind us, unless we're spending 100% of our dollars on grant making, which we aren't, unless you're highly unusual, 5% is, or whatever it is that you have, is actually a number that our foundations have set for themselves, and there's no law that says we can't exceed that. And so just sort of know that we have the capacity to spend more if we choose to do that, and that's definitely an option in a moment like this. That's part of our response, is to increase our payout, and it really does get accentuated by the fact that the markets have dipped and we're going to spend more. So, but just a reminder that we're not constrained by that 5%. Just use that number since that's the federal law. That we always have the option of doing more. And so I think sometimes we forget that and think that there's that barrier that we have to live under.
Thank you, Phil. That's a really, really important point. Appreciate you bringing that up. Finally, another question we hear is, well, okay, well, how do you just jump into a multi-year relationship with a brand new grantee? I mean, how do you do that? Are there some ways to do it in a trust-based way without having to be all in from out the gate? Curious which of our speakers wants to kind of be the first to respond to this question.
I'll go. It's Phil again. Just one thing for us, as we have an open application process, and so anybody who thinks that they match our funding interests is free to apply, and we use the streamlined process too. So in our first year, after sort of kind of doing our due diligence, the first year of any grant that we have is actually a 1-year grant, and it's really kind of a getting to know you and for them to get to know us as well, to see if we're good partners for them as well. And then presuming that everything goes well, everything subsequent to that are typically 3-year grants. And that's how we both have a chance to kind of kick the tires, if you will, and get to know each other better in our work and make sure that our own understandings of what we're partnering with, both sides, is a match.
Thanks, Phil. Pia, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if the question is all in with like maybe specific organizations at the outset, there are other elements of this approach that we're not talking about, but it is, we're a proactive funder. We try to get to know folks as well as we can without taking up too much of their time. We go to live experiences. We try to get out from behind the laptop. So, relationships, they deepen and trust gets built over time. And so it might make sense to give a couple years, you know, a year or two of annual funding to test out that relationship. I'll just give an example of a couple of times that we thought maybe we had found a new multi-year long-term partner. And then the sort of more we walked with them, the more we realized that maybe we had slightly different values, especially around leadership. You know, we think we really look for leaders who are collaborative. We ourselves are a co-executive directorship. We look for kind of humility and partnership as big qualities of the kind of leaders we're looking for. And sometimes you don't know how people really roll until you've been rolling with them. So I think it's, you know, so it's not that we jettison all the steps of that it might take for due diligence. I think we're also specifically talking about long-term and unrestricted funding for partners that we are institutionally very aligned with very clearly, both in terms of their approach to the work and how they inhabit the work, and then what they do. I think that sometimes, you know, unrestricted funding feels like maybe a prize that you have to win from a foundation. Mm-hmm. So we really are trying to be conscious of that power dynamic. And be very transparent upfront. So those are some thoughts. And also you could start with shorter term multi-year, you know, even going from 1 to 2 might be really helpful, 1 to 3. I've also heard foundations often say to me, oh, we've been funding them for 10 or 15 years. And then I ask, you know, just out of curiosity, oh, so then they don't have to reapply every year. And they say, oh no, they do. So when you're talking about, we've been funding people for a decade and yet we make them reapply every year, that seems just like unnecessary work on everyone's part if the relationships of trust already exist and they already have shown kind of a proof of concept. Okay, my supervisor would like to comment. So anyways, those are a couple of thoughts that we have. And again, all of this has to be adaptive to your context. And I think right now, maybe the question of what is risk is a good question to ask. You know, how risky is it to just commit to 3 years right now to a set of partners, especially ones that you already have vetted and that you know.
Thank you, Pia. And thank you for reminding the group that the trust-based philanthropy principles are all really interrelated. So part of what Pia was sharing about is doing the homework. So putting the onus on the funder to really do that due diligence, to get to know prospective grantees, to put that time in. Well, that's actually the topic of our next webinar in April, so we hope you'll join us for that. There was a question from Audie McRae on just kind of more highlights on how to do that do the homework process. Pia, would you mind sharing a little bit more about TWI's process in doing the homework?
Sorry, I'm just reading the question.
The question
oh, actually, maybe
maybe
Claire wants to answer this one. It sounds like, Claire, you were already.
Sure, I'm happy to speak to the financial due diligence piece because that's what we think about and advise on primarily within nonprofit finance fund. And in our experience, the due diligence needed when you are making unrestricted grants is actually significantly less. Because what restricted grants carry with them is a risk of causing harm to the organization, right? They're paying for a certain set of costs, but not necessarily all those costs. And so there's a need to understand the financial health of that organization in a really detailed way. How will your money be playing with other money in the space? Does the organization have the capacity to track and report effectively? Are they able to raise money to fill in the gaps around your money? Those questions, just like they aren't there with unrestricted grant making. And so you can really focus your financial due diligence much more on understanding the need of the organization and how added financial strength and security is going to help them achieve greater impact, greater outcomes within the community. You know, I think you get to focus in on what really matters, which is like, how does this lead to results for the communities that we care about?
Thank you, Claire. We're now opening it up to other questions from the group. You can raise your hand, you can, if you want to pose it to the group, or you can chat them in the chat box. And we've got about 10 more minutes, and we'll do a little brief wrap up before the end of the call. While we wait for more questions to come in, what is another question that has come up, specifically when you're in a multi-year unrestricted or even a trust-based framework. What does that mean for the role of program officers and grant managers? If there's less annual kind of grant oversight happening, what does that mean? How does the role look different, or how should we re-envision what those roles may be? And I'm gonna toss that one to you, Pia, to share how you respond to that one.
I mean, this goes back to the ecosystem that we were describing in the beginning, right? We need new ways of holding an understanding of what the role of a foundation, a funder, a program director, a program officer is. You know, if we, and many have moved in this direction, but if we're moving away from kind of comptroller, you know, gatekeeper, kind of Foucaultian style, you know, that kind of scrutiny role. And I'm not saying all program officers hold that role. Many don't want to, you know, many program officers have said to me, this is what I do on the DL. I just kind of don't tell my institution, you know? So thank you, our folks who are out there kind of doing it, you know, individually when sometimes the organization isn't with you. But I think that there's a fundamental need to reimagine a lot of things, you know, in our economies. And I think one of them is, what is the role of foundation staff? And we're not suggesting that all of a sudden we just jettison all these people, but wondering if their role is more like, you know, learning and kind of more about learning and more about bringing that learning to the audience of their own foundation, maybe up to their trustees. We can learn more about what it takes. Like, right, so just last week, we had office hours with some of our partners, our nonprofit partners, and we were just stunned at what they had already been able to do in just a matter of days, literally a matter of days. One had already organized 150 groups statewide to align around strategy so that this moment doesn't basically make them go under, and sort of to advocate at the state level together in their communication. I mean, amazing. And then another group had already sent out to their very large staff a mental health survey. And if certain staff members scored above a 7 on this survey, that where 10 was a very big concern, they immediately gave them access to mental health, like direct mental health supports. So again, we wouldn't know these things. We wouldn't know how people were pivoting and shifting and listening to their communities if we weren't listening, and if we were more worried about, you know, like what Claire was talking about, that our dollars were being used in a specific part of the work or organization.
Thank you, Pia. We're getting some great questions in the chat box. One from Chelsea Chan, who's with a nonprofit, wondering, what are some ways nonprofits can engage funders, new funders, around this approach? And one thing that we would highly recommend is that you share the Trust-Based Philanthropy website with them and just see if they've heard about it, see what they think. There are a lot of great resources and tools on there. So that's one first step. I'm curious if our other speakers have other advice for our nonprofit leaders on the call.
I think I would add, you know, the Full Cost Project is a wonderful way to get funders involved. There will be workshops across the state of California, and these are workshops that bring together funders and nonprofits in the same room to learn together as peers, to have that really honest dialogue and have conversation outside of the grant transaction, which is one of the only ways that we actually communicate as funders and nonprofits in this sector, and that needs to change. The other thing I would just add is that, you know, from where NFF sits, we have seen, you know, funders are really hungry for honesty. Our granting structures have gotten in the way of that honesty. And so looking for opportunity to share a little more directly about your experience and like what you hope you could have from them in the partnership, you know, find spaces where you can try and test that out, because you may be surprised to get some really positive reactions.
Thank you, Claire. And this is actually kind of connected to the next question from Arjun DeWitt. To what extent can you really speak of equal relationships, even with unrestricted funding? Can you actually avoid that grantees act in line with what they think the funder expects of them? So this is getting back into that question of the power dynamic. So how do you navigate that? And I'm going to toss this one to you, Phil, to share how you think about this at Robert Sterling Clark Foundation.
Sure. And I think the first thing I would just sort of say is that as much as we would want everything to be a level playing field and completely equal, that isn't the case. The fact that the resources sit with the foundation, and there's inherent power that comes with that, and that never goes away. And so as much as we want to flatten it, and that would be the goal, the truth is that there's always going to be more power seemingly implicitly sitting with the funder. And so I think one of our goals is to really try to make it as equal as we can. And so, but part of that is, I think part of it is you can say whatever you want, and that's just like the pledge. You can say whatever you want, but it's in the actions that you take and the ways that you engage and work with people that prove to them that you are truly kind of wanting to be a partner with them. And I will say for us, at the beginning, we were saying, this is how we want to act and behave and engage with you. And those were just words. And I think it takes time, right, in terms of building relationship and building understanding of what that means for folks to really take us at our word. I think in our world, people talk about trust and how do you earn that trust, or in vulnerability and things of that nature. And actually what we would say is that by being vulnerable and sort of showing our warts or kind of our flaws or the mistakes that we've made. And if you've ever been on our website, we have something called Face Plants, which chronicles our foibles and our mistakes along the way to show that we are not perfect. But showing kind of your own vulnerability actually helps build trust, because it shows that you're willing to share some of the not so pretty sides of you, or the things that you have not always been perfect. And so I think many people think once you trust somebody, you become vulnerable. We would assert that it goes the other way around, that by being vulnerable, we help people understand or sort of build more trust with us. And that's just one mechanism of that kind of continuum. But I would say that, you know, our goal is to flatten that power dynamic as much as possible so that we can really be equal partners, and we aim for that, but I don't know if that's truly possible.
Thank you, Phil. Pia, please add to that.
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and because there's always the lens that we have to be very cognizant of, that people might just be telling us what we want to hear. I really appreciate Phil's points about vulnerability. Some of the ways that this goes into some work that there is in kind of the humanities about how do you know when you're trusted. And one of the things that we notice is that people actually come to us with very real problems. You know, can't make payroll. I feel like I need to quit tomorrow, and they're the ED. We're having trouble fundraising. Can you move our grant, up because we just lost a major grant. So one of the ways that we pay attention to whether or not there seems to be sort of deeper trust in a relationship, and it varies with different partners. Some partners, the bandwidth of trust is like very wide, and you can tell because they're just so forthcoming about things that nobody wants to tell a funder. My major senior staff person just quit. We have a scandal going on around, sexual abuse allegations. I mean, people share with us things that normally people do not share with funders. And I think that's part of and then we can share, what's troubling us, what's concerning us, where we're uncertain, just like Phil said. So I think there are ways to see that, especially if we're really committed to not having relationships be performative, and that we really show up in them as ourselves. Like if you call the Whitman Institute's office, you will reach John or I. Well, not right now because no one's in the office, but normally you can call the office and there's not a lot of like, cushion between getting access to us and being part of it just out in the world. And I just briefly there's some other questions that have emerged in the private chat, which one has to do with what if your team is very compliance oriented? I think that we don't have a lot of time now. So I'll just say I'm happy to talk about this offline. Again, there's the other 5 webinars coming up. We'll probably have some insights into that. And Trust-Based Philanthropy Project will be offering a webinar with like kind of a legal lens and maybe a financial sort of auditing lens. So stay tuned for that, but also just feel free to reach out so we can be, and this is true in general, reach out to us if you have sort of practical application questions, like bigger abstract pedagogy questions. We're here to be a resource to the sector. And then I'm going to pass it back to you, probably Shadi, to close up.
Thank you, thank you. So a few key takeaways, and we will be sending the PowerPoint out. Thank you, Kate, for offering to do that. So just wanted to share some of these key takeaways. We had many more that came up in this discussion, but these are some kind of big points that we wanted to make sure that you leave with. So this is about culture and values. Multi-year unrestricted funding is just one component of a holistic trust-based approach. So many of these questions that are coming up around power and alleviating power imbalance really can be done when approaching these practices collectively. So we want to emphasize it's a little awkward that we've done a deep dive into this one principle because it really is kind of scaffolded by all the other principles. So please do tune in for our next series of webinars. Claire Knowlton really drove home the point that nonprofits need profits. Unrestricted surpluses allow organizations to build long-term financial health. And unrestricted funding is considerably less risky than restricted funding because it allows nonprofits to be flexible and responsive. Steps that you can take now, first and foremost, audit your expectations for the year. This is, there's a lot of uncertainty and unpredictability happening right now. If you are predominantly offering restricted grants, consider whether you're willing to unrestrict those dollars in this moment, especially using some of those tips offered by Jean Tom. It's really as simple as adding an amendment to current agreements. Check out the Trust-Based Philanthropy website for tools and resources. We've got one tool that is actually about how to show up in a trust-based way, written by Pia Infante, that offers some real tips on how to actually be in relationship with grantee partners. Definitely check out the Full Cost Project website. It was chatted in the chat box. It's going through an update, but you can check out some of those tools online now, and there will be more to come. We have a survey. We would love your feedback on how this went. My colleague Ayushi is going to chat that in the chat box now. It's super brief. We promise it'll take you less than 5 minutes. And feel free to email us at hello@trustbasedphilanthropy.org if you still have questions that were unresolved, or if you want to talk about how this works in your own context. We have an amazing steering committee of foundation leaders that have made themselves available to support other funders that are going through these changes. So we want to be a resource to you. And we are so grateful to you for being here. We are now at 11:32 Pacific time. So we are going to wrap it up. And please stay tuned for the next webinar. It will be in the follow-up email. Thank you to our speakers, Phil Lee, Pia Infante, Claire Knowlton, Jean Tom making a cameo appearance. And thanks again to Philanthropy California for being such amazing partners. And thank you to Northern California grant makers for running the show, and Kate for being so cool and collected in the moment of craziness with tech disruption. Thank you all. We hope to see you on the next call. Thanks again. Bye-bye.